So I'm going to talk about this conjunction of two things that I don't often put together, but it made me think a little more about both journalism and the working class by putting them into the same question: do journalists care about the working class? Since the Center for Working Class Studies is my host here. But we can talk about whatever you want once I finish these few remarks, whether it's Iraq, journalism, politics, or anything. So my kind of glib answer, the short version, is no, not very much. Journalists don't pay a lot of attention to the working class in this country. And there's a few reasons for that. One, and actually John Russo and Sherry Link and I were talking about this on the way over, Americans like success stories. They like to read about people who rise to the top. They like celebrity stories. They like winners, basically. And even in the middle of the darkest days of the recession, you were at least as likely to read about a hedge fund manager who he doesn't want to go. He wants to stay too much. Even in the recession at its darkest moment, you could pick up a paper and just likely read about a hedge fund manager who lost half his net worth as about a guy working at a packaging plant who lost his job. The former story is more exciting, it's sexier, it's more glamorous. If the fall is steeper, that's also sort of got more reward for the reader. So it's hard to get Americans to believe that things are hard and might remain hard. It just goes directly against so much of our national DNA. And related to that is the phenomenon that I found in my former reporting, which is that American editors are more likely to let you write about unemployment if it's in, say, Iraq or in Burma than if it's in Youngstown or Baltimore. And I think that's because editors think they've already heard about unemployment in Youngstown and Baltimore. We know that story. How often have I heard that from editors? We don't need to hear it again, even if they really don't know the story or they haven't heard this story. Whereas someone in Iraq who's unemployed is someone who might pick up a gun and join an insurgency, is someone whose story the editor doesn't feel he or she knows. So in a way, writing stories from, say, the lower 60% of society, I've found, is much easier if you're doing it in a foreign country than if you're doing it in this country. Second reason is Americans don't really have a strong sense of class. We all know that from time immemorial, from study and from our own lives. How many Americans would say, if you asked them what class are you, I'm from the working class? I'm sure Sherry, John, and maybe a few others here could give us the answer to that question. What is the answer?
Well, it depends upon how you ask the question. The General Social Survey has been asking Americans that question with 4 possible answers since 1972. Are you upper class, middle class, working class, or lower class? When you ask it that way, about 42 to 46% say they're working class, and about the same percentage say they're middle class. If you ask them, are you upper class, middle class, or lower class, nearly everybody puts themselves in the middle class.
The great middle class, right? So if you give them the choices, they'll actually say, well, I'm surprised by that, and that actually is kind of encouraging because it shows that those numbers sound pretty accurate, depending on how you define them. But I found anecdotally that if I ask, say, a bus driver or waitress what class do you belong to, I'm very likely to hear that they belong to the middle class, which is always a little surprising. And the flip side of that is I also often hear, especially recently, reporting in Ohio and in Florida and in North Carolina and Virginia, there is no more middle class, which is a kind of way of saying things have really gone downhill here. The middle class has been eroded. That doesn't mean there's a working class. That means there's rich and poor. That's the alternative to the middle class, not a working class. So given that problem of self-identification, it's hard to expect there to be coverage targeted at the working class, given how few people have a sense of what it actually is. There's this confusion about who's working class. Most people in the media still have an idea that if you're working class, it means you work in a factory. It means you punch in and punch out, you wear overalls, you carry heavy tools. If you were to do a cartoon to illustrate the story about the working class, it would be kind of a 30s style social realism classic worker. There aren't very many of them left, as people in Youngstown know better than just about anyone in this country. Much more likely to be people in service jobs, people in temporary work, people making $8 or $10 an hour in a shop or in a restaurant. That is true all over the country, and yet it is still not quite taken hold in the understanding of journalists when journalists talk about the working class. I actually Googled journalist and working class to prepare for this talk, and found that about 90% of the results I got were from the UK. And that's because there they have a very strong sense of class, and the working class has a very strong sense of itself, even now, in spite of the erosions that have gone on there. I'm sorry. So all of that is part of the explanation for why journalists might not care very much about it. In a sense, it's invisible. It doesn't quite exist in their minds because it's still an elusive and kind of invisible thing in this country. And back to the UK, I found a report that was actually picked up on in the Center for Working Class Studies website from a couple of years ago on the state of journalism and who was becoming a journalist in England. And it turned out to have results that were quite applicable here. Namely, the working class is not headed toward journalism. People who become journalists in England and here more and more tend to be from the middle or the upper middle class, people who have a college degree, which is the simplest way to define it. And in fact, in England, journalism ranks third on the list of the most socially exclusive professions after doctors and lawyers. So that leads to my third reason why journalists here don't care very much about the working class. And that's that they aren't working class themselves. They don't come from the working class. There's an old type that we all have in our heads, mainly from black and white movies and old style newspapers, of the kind of hard-nosed, shoe leather, not journalists, reporter. There's a difference. They used to call themselves reporters, and I think change shows a class advance, if you will, between, say, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and today. Reporters were not professionals. They didn't belong to a profession like doctors and lawyers. They were tradesmen. They practiced a trade. Their trade was reporting. They didn't have to carry on airs about professional standards. They prided themselves on their street smarts and on knowing their way around the city and on knowing how to get at the stories that someone more educated and, in their view, maybe someone a little prissier wouldn't know how to get. And so we've all seen movies like The Front Page, which kind of glorify that type, but they actually existed. They began to fade away with the fading away of the urban working class in the 60s and 70s. What was sort of left behind was the Metro columnist, who still sort of played the part and was the part of a working class reporter, but he had a column. His name was Jimmy Breslin or Mike Royko or Pete Hamill. Most big city papers continue to have them, but I think something kind of artificial set in, because the culture they came from really no longer existed. It didn't support them. And so they, or Mike Barnacle of the Boston Globe, most of them seem to be Irish, they no longer really city. And instead, they kind of acquired, maybe I'd even say some sentimental tics that reminded them of those old days, but it had become more and more museum-like. And today, it's almost an extinct species, the working class urban colonists. So instead, reporters became journalists. They went to journalism school. They spent a lot of money on grad school. They began to rub elbows more and more with people with more money, bankers, politicians, businessmen. And they became less able to penetrate the rather, in some ways parochial and closed ranks of the working class, as the working class still existed. So the fact that journalists, sort of gave themselves a promotion in class by calling themselves that, no longer came from those ranks, from those parts of the city or the country, meant that they just didn't really have a feel for that life. They didn't think about it all the time. They didn't have an instinct for how working class people thought or lived. The working class became something a little more exotic. It was this thing out there, this other, almost like a foreign country, almost like reporting from a foreign country. I found a quote by a writer who's pretty well known, Barbara Ehrenreich, who described journalists this way. Journalists are not part of an elite akin to movie stars, anchor persons, and hedge fund managers. We are part of the working class, which is exactly how journalists have seen themselves through most of American history, as working stiffs. We can be underpaid, we can be jerked around, we can be laid off arbitrarily, just like any auto worker or mechanic or hotel housekeeper or flight attendant. So that is the idea of the journalist as reporter, and I think it's out of date. I think it rings a little false. I don't think journalists see themselves in the same way that flight attendants or mechanics or auto workers do. I think it's an ideal that Ehrenreich doesn't want to let go of, but it's no longer really true. I think what's truer today is something that Connie Schultz of the Cleveland Plain Dealer told the reporter Alec McGillis in an interview 2 months ago in the Columbia Journalism Review. Here's what she said, and she comes from the working class. She's one of the rare ones still left. She said, in journalism, it's become increasingly about where you went to school. At the bigger papers, it's become more and more the privilege covering the privilege. You have to do an internship to get hired, so you have to be able to afford to work for free for a summer, which eliminates a lot of kids right there. Today, you're hard-pressed to meet a young reporter who comes from the working class or who's a first-generation college student. I think that that is closer to the truth. Maybe less so in smaller towns and small-town newspapers, but certainly in big cities, journalists don't see themselves in the terms Ehrenreich described, and objectively they come out of the background that Connie Schultz described. I mean, I live in New York, and in New York, the people you meet who want to be journalists or who are journalists mainly went to Ivy League schools or to excellent state schools or other private schools. They went to New York because it was the place to make it. They hang around with other people who are trying to do the same thing. They're very savvy. They read everything on the web. Their life experience, and here I am grossly generalizing, but what the hell? That's my prerogative as a lecturer. Their life experience is rather narrow. It's rather shallow. They probably haven't suffered too many great setbacks. They haven't known poverty. They haven't known failure. They might not know great success, but they're certainly, around other ambitious people and have caught the bug. They go to parties where they meet other people in that field and have a better chance of breaking into a magazine or a website or a TV station because they're circulating in that area. In Washington, it's similar, except that politics is more the company, the town company rather than media, but it's still that kind of person who becomes a journalist. And they all know each other, they all read each other's blogs, they date each other, they marry each other. It becomes like so many other parts of our society these days, a kind of ingrown self-perpetuating class. And the chances that someone from that background living in that atmosphere is going to be able to write a truly great piece of journalism about, say, a Brooklyn bus driver, or for that matter, someone working in a pizza restaurant in Youngstown, are pretty slim. Not because they might not want to, but because they will be such strangers to that subject, and in some ways have such an inability to pick up all the social cues that you need in order to understand. And also, I'd say because probably they won't have an editor who thinks it's worth doing, and because they themselves might not think it's worth doing. And added to that is the effect of the web, which is to make reporting less and less central to journalism. The web has turned everyone into a journalist, but the kind of journalism that everyone now practices, or most people, is essentially a form of opinion writing, in which if you get actual reporting, it's a rare thing. If someone has made a phone call or two, that means they've done real legwork, because it's so easy to start a blog and have a bunch of opinions and read some other blogs and link to them and think that you've done your reporting. So I'd say the push of journalism toward electronic opinion and away from going out on the street and actually talking to people has also made it more estranged from the working class and more an affair of people who are very educated and read a lot of other people on the web and have a lot of opinions and are confident in those opinions because they come from a background where you're encouraged at the dinner table to have a lot of opinions, and you're encouraged at school to have a lot of opinions, even if you don't really know what you're talking about. So all of this caricature, I admit, is a kind of, it's creating a kind of journalist who, just the chances of their connecting working class subjects and stories is pretty slim. And then the last reason is, and this is not the fault of reporters at all, most newspapers and magazines are not interested in a working class audience. And that's because what they are interested in is an audience that has the disposable income that advertisers love, who are able to spend money on products that advertisers sell, and that is, until recently, has been the backbone of the business model for journalism until the web came along. So, because their target is not the working class, they only become interested in the working class when there's a disaster, like a mine accident, that is news, is hard news, that is worth covering, and it involves the working class, or when they are publishing like a feature about the working class or the poor, who are representatives of that class. That's the purpose of the story, to show what's happening with the working class, but not incidentally covering their lives, the lives of people who happen to be working class. That's a rare thing in American newspapers today. And in fact, I found a study by an academic named Andrew Klein, who spent 2 months reading every issue of the Springfield News Leader in Missouri from cover to cover, 60 issues in all. And he found that 12 of the articles, not issues, 12 articles in those 60 issues had what he called actionable information for the poor and the working class. For example, an article called "Fundraiser Puts Shoes on Local Children's Feet" discussed this subject, not from the point of view of a mother who might need to get shoes for her children and might need to know how she could take advantage of this program, but from the point of view of people who might want to contribute shoes. In other words, the implicit bias was, if you already have shoes, you don't need them, and you might want to contribute them before you go. There was an article on the John Deere plant that was going to hire 55 new workers. It didn't describe what the skills of those workers needed to be, how they might get hired, how they might get trained. Instead, it was about the economic benefit that these new jobs would bring to the larger community. In other words, it's more from the point of view of business than people who needed jobs. All of this is so obvious that it hardly bears saying, and yet when you think about it, it's sort of striking. articles are not written from the point of view of people who make, say, less than $30,000 a year. If you read the business pages, it's mainly written with the assumption that you are a manager or an investor, not that you're a worker. And since the 80s, financial news has exploded, labor news has dwindled almost to nothing. So that's a kind of bleak picture of journalism and its relation to working class. And I'm going to end with a couple of qualifications that make it less bleak and maybe offer a hope that things might change in the future. One is this, that I don't think that most, sorry, let me back up a second. I'm not going to argue that working class papers are the answer to this. Because, in fact, if you look at the New York Daily News, which is a working class paper, it's a paper for people who drive buses and work in restaurants and who make $30,000, $40,000 a year. Its stories are not about those people and their jobs and their lives and their struggles. Its stories are about scandal, sports, crime, celebrities, things that most Americans love to read about. In fact, if you want to read about the working class, it'd be better to look at the New York Times, which is the elite newspaper in New York. The New York Times actually still has a labor reporter, Stephen Greenhouse. It has a young woman who I know, actually named Sabrina Tavernese, who's kind of got the working class beat covered in the Midwest. She gets to go to Ohio and write about fracking, and write about single mothers. She covers the census from the point of view of people, again, making less than $40,000 a year. That's the New York Times. They have the money to do it, and they also have the readership that's interested. It may well be that working class people don't want to read about being working class. They want to read about people who made it. They want to read about aspiration, whereas the New York Times readers, who are doctors and lawyers and journalists, are more likely to want to read about the working class because it doesn't threaten their aspirations. And they read about it in a way that treats the working class as an object of study, perhaps of sympathy, perhaps of indignation, but not as one of us. For example, if you open up the Times and read a story, and I don't know how relevant this is to Youngstown, it may be relevant to Cleveland, it may be relevant to Pittsburgh, as far as the biases of the paper, maybe it's relevant to the Vindicator too. But if you open up the New York Times, you read a story about parents who are paying tutors to get their 5-year-old into the Gifted and Talented program. It's written as if you are one of those parents and you're sharing the anxiety and the fretting and the aggravation and the ambition of the characters in the story. But if you read a story in the Times about a woman who is facing the ending of her jobless benefits, it's written from her point of view. She is out there alone. You're not identifying with her. You're looking at her as someone to sympathize with or to think about. So it just shows, again, that bias that I mentioned earlier. And I don't want to blame individual reporters for this. I know a lot of reporters who would like to write about a woman in Kentucky who might be losing her jobless benefits. It's just very difficult to get it past editors who say, we've heard that story, it's very difficult to get it past the business side who say, where's the advertising going to come from? Now back to what I started to say earlier. 2 things that have happened recently that I think might change this whole dynamic. One is the campaign and election of Barack Obama. I would bet you, and I can't prove this, but I would bet you that the term working class has exploded in use in the last 4 years. And the reason is journalists have suddenly discovered that the working class, and not the working class, but one big segment of it, the white working class, is now the base of the Republican Party. It's taken 30 years for journalists to realize that this had happened. It hasn't happened all at once, but it has been happening over the last 30 years. That makes it this huge voting bloc that is essentially going to decide election after election in states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, and Michigan and Indiana and other swing states. So journalists have started paying a lot of attention to the white working class. And I really emphasize that because there's also a black working class, a Hispanic working class, and others that are almost invisible in the media. If you think the working class is invisible, the black working class is even more invisible because it's, you know, it challenges the two stereotypes we have of the black poor and then the black upper middle class. So, but the white working class as a political bloc has become a major subject of interest to American journalists, and that's why I say I think the use of that term has exploded. It's of interest to me. I came to Ohio in 2008 to cover the election. I spent a lot of time in Columbus and in southeastern Ohio, and I found myself facing a lot of challenges in talking to people because I was aware, acutely aware, of what I had said earlier, that this was a kind of foreign reporting excursion for me. That I was going, in some ways, and I hate to say this, but in some ways I was going farther from home than when I go to Iraq or when I go to Lebanon. Because, and it's partly because we do still know each other. We're all Americans. We have that commonality. We have a common memory of a time when Americans were more like each other, when there was less inequality. But at the same time, inequality and the gap between us, almost just mentally, has grown so great. To do those stories, you feel almost like a voyeur. And so I try to counteract that in the way I always do as a reporter, which is to spend a lot of time talking to people and not just to go and get a quick quote from them and get out. But I can't say honestly that completely overcame that feeling I had, which was that I was treating them as something exotic. I wasn't the only one. A lot of reporters were covering this because it seemed like the real test for Obama. If he lost this vote, the white working class vote, overwhelmingly, he was going to lose the election. And it seemed like he might because, as we all know from reading these reports, the white working class is less likely to vote for a black man than is the white upper middle class, the white middle class. And the primaries showed that. Obama was crushed in Kentucky. He was crushed in West Virginia. He lost Ohio. He lost Pennsylvania. Even as he was, by that time, the nominee apparent. He was sailing to nomination and still getting crushed in states where there was a large white working class population. This was concerned journalists a lot because it seemed like this was really going to decide the election. And what happened between the primaries in November was enough members of that class decided that they would rather vote for a guy who seemed to have their economic interests at heart than to vote for the party that had kind of captured their identity. Talk about identity politics. The white working class now practices identity politics in this country. Enough of them moved that way that Obama held his own with that vote and had large majorities in other categories and obviously won the election. This was not a done deal, and it would at times seem like it might go either way. I was quite interested in it. Others were. After the election, Frank Rich, the New York Times columnist, wrote a column in which he said, Obama also won all four of those hunting and Hillary-loving Rust Belt states that became 2008's obsession among slumming upper-middle-class white journalists. Pennsylvania and Michigan by double digits, as well as Ohio and even Indiana. So I took that a little hard because he was calling me a slumming upper-middle-class white journalist, and I wrote a blog post saying, that's actually called reporting, since you can't sit in Midtown Manhattan and know what people across the country think. Anyway, this interest in the white working class's voting bloc has returned some journalists, I think, to remembering that there's a big country out there with a lot of different people who are not like them and whose views are of great interest and importance. I think that's going to continue. The second event recently that's changed my dark picture a bit is the recession. I mean, yes, you could cover the recession as something that happened to hedge fund managers, but after a certain point, you would have to acknowledge there were a lot more people who were in danger of losing their homes, who lost their jobs, who were losing their benefits, who were really running into quite desperate circumstances. And I found that it was easier to write about a hedge fund manager and get it published than it was to write about someone facing foreclosure. Again, that problem of the editor No, you haven't. So a lot of stories about foreclosure you haven't heard. We need to go find them, and that became one of my missions from 2009 onward, to sort of force my more elite readers of the New Yorker magazine to read stories from Florida, from Ohio, from Kentucky, rather from North Carolina, from Virginia, that were about what the effects of the recession was, which has been huge. It's been huge. It's, in a sense, caught much of the rest of the country up with Youngstown. We were there before, now some of the other places are there, and will continue to be there, because what it did was it showed journalists how many working class people there are in the country, how great the disparities are between them and people in what you might call the mass upper class, including journalists. And it also showed how small the gap can be once you begin to slide downward between those two, and how many Americans were actually closer than they imagined to falling into the working class, because it had turned out that a recession, a job loss, an illness, some missed mortgage payments, and you were headed that way. And that, I think, actually put into journalism a more visceral sense of it than they had for quite some time. So those two things have turned the attention of journalists back to the working class. Whether that's going to make a long